The Justice Department has now released a big new batch of documents in the Jeffrey Epstein investigation, and these include new details about Epstein's one-time friendship with President Trump. Look, there is a lot to go through. We said it's like more than 10,000 pages, so we are digging through this, but this is what is seen so far. In a 2020 email, an assistant U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York wrote that Trump traveled on Epstein's private jet, quote, more times than previously has been reported, at least 8 times between 1993 and 96. And on a flight in 1993, according to the email, there was just 3 passengers: Trump, Epstein, and what's described as a 20-year-old woman. Being mentioned in a trove of investigatory documents does not demonstrate criminal wrongdoing, a reminder, and Trump has not been accused of being involved in Epstein's crimes. On Monday, the president did seem dismayed that the release of any and all of these files, though, could harm the reputations of individuals he said, quote, innocently met Epstein. Now, remember, he is the man they also signed into law last month, a measure requiring the Justice Department to do just this, release the files.
I need to tell you about something that just happened that should make your blood boil. The Justice Department just released another massive batch of documents from the Jeffrey Epstein investigation, and what's buried in these files is absolutely explosive. We're talking about evidence that directly contradicts years of carefully crafted narrative from Donald Trump about his relationship with one of the most notorious sex traffickers in modern history. And the way the DOJ is handling this release, the sloppiness, the selective redactions, the glacial pace, all of it suggests something far more sinister than bureaucratic incompetence.
A lot of people are very angry that pictures are being released of other people that really had nothing to do with Epstein, but they're in a picture with him because he was at a party, and you ruin the reputation of somebody.
As we speak, CNN has a team working through the documents just released. We are going to bring you the findings as they come in. CNN's Caitlin Polans is live in Washington this morning. A lot to work through, and we're just getting started. Caitlin, what do you have so far?
We're just getting started, but the headline here is quite clear. Donald Trump is all over these documents. In that first trove that the Justice Department released on Friday, there were just a few very scant mentions of Trump, including in a picture collected with a bunch of other pictures. In this one, there is already one very illuminating email that was sent during the first presidency of Donald Trump while prosecutors in the Southern District of New York were working on the case against Epstein co-conspirator Ghislaine Maxwell. This is after Epstein's death. And one of those prosecutors writes, I'm going to read from this letter because it is what was new to the prosecutors at the time and what is new to us now, receiving these documents now in the public sphere from the Justice Department. The prosecutor, unnamed, an assistant U.S. attorney of the Southern District of New York, wrote on January 8th of 2020, the flight records we received yesterday reflect that Donald Trump traveled on Epstein's private jet many more times than previously has been reported or that we were aware.
This looks like a deliberate effort to control information, protect powerful people, and minimize the damage to reputations that frankly deserve to be destroyed. Before we get into the specifics of what these new documents reveal, I want you to understand the context because it matters tremendously. Trump himself signed legislation requiring the Justice Department to release all of these files. He put his signature on a law demanding transparency about the Epstein investigation. And now that the files are actually coming out and his name is all over them in ways that completely undermine his public statements, suddenly he's concerned about people's reputations being ruined. Yesterday, Trump was complaining that a lot of people are very angry that pictures are being released of other people who really had nothing to do with Epstein, but were in a picture with him at a party. He said, you're ruining the reputation of somebody just because they were photographed with Epstein at some event. Think about the audacity of that position. Trump signed the law requiring these releases. But now that the releases are happening and they're exposing uncomfortable truths about his own extensive connections to Epstein, suddenly it's all very unfair and people's reputations are being destroyed unjustly. That's not concern for innocent people. That's panic about what else might come out. That's someone who knows there's more damaging material in these files and is trying to preemptively discredit the entire release by framing it as unfair to people who just happen to be photographed with Epstein. But here's the problem with that narrative. What's coming out in these documents isn't just photographs from parties. We're not talking about people who shook Epstein's hand at a charity gala one time, and now their reputation is being unfairly tarnished. We're talking about extensive documented relationships, repeated travel on Epstein's private jet, presence at properties where abuse was occurring, and connections that federal prosecutors themselves found significant enough to document and investigate. That's not guilt by association. That's a pattern of behavior that demands scrutiny and accountability. Now, let me walk you through what was actually revealed in this latest document dump because the details are devastating. The most explosive piece of evidence is an email from an assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York dated January 2020. This was during Trump's first presidency, while prosecutors were working on the case against Ghislaine Maxwell after Epstein's death. And what this prosecutor wrote should be front-page news everywhere. The email states that flight records they received show Donald Trump traveled on Epstein's private jet many more times than previously had been reported or that prosecutors were even aware of. Let that sink in for a moment. Federal prosecutors working on the biggest sex trafficking case of the decade discovered flight records showing the president had been on Epstein's plane far more frequently than anyone knew. This isn't speculation from a conspiracy theorist. This is documentation from federal investigators who are actively building a criminal case. The email gets even more specific and more damning. It states that Trump flew on Epstein's jet at least 8 times between 1993 and 1996. On one flight in 1993, the only 2 passengers listed were Donald Trump and Jeffrey Epstein, just the 2 of them on a private jet together. On another flight, the only 3 passengers were Epstein, Trump, and a 20-year-old woman. And on 2 other flights, passengers included women who would later become possible witnesses in the Maxwell case. Think about what that means. Trump was traveling on Epstein's private jet with women who were involved in or witnessed criminal activity that Maxwell was eventually convicted of facilitating. The prosecutor who wrote this email concluded by saying they didn't want any of this to be a surprise down the road. That's a direct quote. The Southern District of New York was documenting Trump's extensive connections to Epstein because they knew it was significant. They knew it might become relevant. And they were making sure their superiors in the Justice Department were aware of what they'd found so nobody could claim later that this information came as a shock. Now, here's what makes this even more significant. This email was written in January 2020. Trump was president at the time. Federal prosecutors were actively working on a case involving his longtime associate, and they discovered flight records showing far more extensive contact than Trump had ever publicly acknowledged. And somehow this information never became public until now, years later, through a forced document release that Trump is now complaining about. Ask yourself why that might be. Why would evidence showing the sitting president had traveled extensively on a sex trafficker's private jet with potential witnesses to sex crimes remain buried during his presidency? The answer should be obvious, because releasing it would have been politically explosive, because it would have raised questions about Trump's credibility and judgment and potential knowledge of what Epstein was doing, because it would have forced uncomfortable conversations about whether the president was being fully honest about the nature of his relationship with a convicted predator. So the information stayed classified, stayed hidden, stayed protected until a law forced its release. And even now it's coming out slowly, in tranches, with heavy redactions and mistakes that require documents to be pulled back and re-released. Let's talk about those mistakes because they're revealing. The DOJ claimed they're releasing documents slowly because they're concerned about protecting victims. That sounds noble. That sounds like they're being careful and thoughtful. Except they've already screwed up multiple times in ways that expose their real priorities. In the Monday release, documents were posted that included a victim's name who wished to remain anonymous. That information wasn't properly redacted. It was exposed to the public. The documents had to be pulled down and re-released with proper redactions. So the Justice Department is supposedly being so careful to protect people, but they accidentally expose a victim's identity while simultaneously making sure that every reference that might embarrass or implicate powerful people is carefully managed and controlled. That doesn't look like protecting victims. That looks like protecting power while using victim protection as cover for slow-rolling a release that's politically inconvenient. A former prosecutor pointed out that redacting these documents appropriately is hard work, but the DOJ has thousands of lawyers and unlimited resources to do it properly. They shouldn't be making mistakes, particularly mistakes involving victim names, yet they are making those mistakes, which suggests either stunning incompetence or a deliberate effort to create confusion and delay while controlling what information gets out and when. We also learned from the Washington Post's review of these documents that there was a subpoena sent to Mar-a-Lago in 2021 for records related to the government's case against Ghislaine Maxwell. So federal prosecutors building a sex trafficking case needed records from Trump's property. This confirms what we already knew about Virginia Giuffre being recruited from Mar-a-Lago, but it also shows prosecutors believed there was material evidence at Trump's club relevant to their criminal case. That's not a casual connection. That's Trump's property being functionally part of the infrastructure that enabled Epstein's operation. Think about how Trump and his defenders have characterized his relationship with Epstein over the years. They've consistently claimed it was minimal, that they were casual acquaintances who occasionally crossed paths at social events, that Trump banned Epstein from Mar-a-Lago years ago because he didn't like his behavior. They've portrayed Trump as someone who barely knew Epstein and certainly had no idea what he was involved in. And every single time new documents come out, that narrative gets exposed as a lie. Trump didn't casually know Epstein. He traveled on his private jet at least 8 times that we now know about, possibly more. He was alone with Epstein on flights. He traveled with Epstein and young women who would later be witnesses in criminal cases. He spent time at Epstein's properties. Epstein recruited victims from Trump's property. Federal prosecutors needed records from Mar-a-Lago to build their case against Epstein's co-conspirator. And Epstein himself wrote in a letter just before his death that Trump shared his predatory interest in young girls. That's not a casual acquaintance. That's an extensive relationship spanning years, involving private travel, shared social circles, overlapping properties, and what appears to be shared interests in young women. Every new document release makes that clearer. And every time it becomes clearer, Trump and his defenders pivot to complaining that the releases are unfair, or that people's reputations are being destroyed, or that this is all politically motivated. But here's what they can't explain away. These aren't documents created by Trump's political enemies. These are internal Justice Department files. These are emails from federal prosecutors. These are flight logs and subpoenas and investigative records created by law enforcement during the course of a legitimate criminal investigation. You can't dismiss that as political hit jobs. These are the government's own records of what they found when they investigated Jeffrey Epstein and his operation. And what they found was that Donald Trump was far more embedded in Epstein's world than he's ever publicly acknowledged. They found flight records showing extensive private travel together. They found connections significant enough that prosecutors felt they needed to document them and alert their superiors. They found evidence at Trump's property relevant to a sex trafficking prosecution. All of that is now part of the official record. It exists. It's documented. And no amount of complaining about unfairness or claims of political persecution can make it go away. Let's also address Trump's recent comments trying to minimize all of this by saying everyone in Palm Beach knew Epstein and was friendly with him. That's technically true. Epstein did socialize in those circles, but there's a massive difference between being photographed with someone at a party and traveling alone with them on private jets. There's a difference between casual social contact and having victims recruited from your property. There's a difference between knowing someone tangentially and having federal prosecutors document your connection as potentially significant to a criminal case. Trump is trying to hide behind the fig leaf of lots of people knew Epstein to avoid confronting the specific documented evidence of how extensively he knew Epstein. It's like saying lots of people knew Bernie Madoff to defend someone who was on Madoff's yacht multiple times and had business dealings with him. The two situations aren't comparable. and everyone can see Trump is trying to minimize something that the documentary record shows was far more than he's willing to admit. Ghislaine Maxwell gave an interview where she said she never saw Trump do anything that wasn't gentlemanly or showed any impropriety. Trump's defenders are already using that quote to suggest he's been cleared. But think about what that actually means. Maxwell, who was convicted of sex trafficking minors for Epstein, says she never saw Trump do anything wrong. That's supposed to be exculpatory. That's supposed to make us feel better. The woman who facilitated Epstein's abuse didn't witness Trump participating in that abuse, so clearly he's innocent. That's an absurdly low bar. That's like saying someone who worked at a criminal organization never personally witnessed you committing crimes, therefore you must have had no knowledge of what was happening. It proves nothing except that Maxwell has a vested interest in protecting powerful people who might otherwise be implicated in the operation she was convicted of running. Her testimony is worthless as evidence of Trump's innocence. If anything, it suggests she understands that protecting Trump might be in her long-term interest. What we're watching unfold through these document releases is a systematic exposure of how our justice system protected powerful people connected to Jeffrey Epstein. We're seeing evidence that federal prosecutors knew Trump's connections were far more extensive than publicly acknowledged. We're seeing that this information was documented but kept quiet. We're seeing that even now, as it's being forced out through legal requirements, it's being released slowly and carefully in ways that minimize impact and give Trump's defenders time to craft responses and muddy the waters. This isn't how justice is supposed to work. When law enforcement discovers evidence of potential criminal activity or connections to criminal activity, that information should be pursued aggressively and transparently. But that's not what happened here. What happened is prosecutors found troubling connections to the sitting president, documented them internally, and then apparently did nothing with that information. They didn't interview Trump. They didn't subpoena his records. They didn't investigate whether he had knowledge of Epstein's crimes based on his extensive contact. They just let it sit. And now, years later, we're finding out through forced disclosures that all of this evidence existed while Trump was president, and nobody did anything with it. Nobody asked the hard questions. Nobody demanded answers. Nobody investigated whether the president's long-standing relationship with a sex trafficker represented a security risk or a criminal exposure. They just protected him through silence and inaction. That's the real scandal. Not just what Trump did or didn't do with Epstein, but the systematic failure of every institution that should have been investigating this to actually do their jobs. The FBI that didn't pursue leads, the prosecutors who documented evidence but didn't act on it, the Justice Department that kept damaging information classified. All of them failed. All of them prioritized protecting a powerful person over seeking truth and justice. And victims see this. Survivors of Epstein's abuse watch these documents come out, and they see federal prosecutors knew things years ago that they're only learning about now. They see evidence that was documented but buried. They see institutions that could have pursued accountability but chose not to, and they rightfully feel betrayed. One survivor explained to CNN that nobody from the Justice Department reached out to survivors for input on how these releases should be handled. Nobody asked victims what they wanted. Nobody consulted the people who actually suffered at Epstein's hands. She described the release process as incredibly sloppy, inconsistent, and thoughtless, names being left unredacted haphazardly while other information is carefully protected. And she made a critical point. The law required all of these files to be released by December 19th at 11:59 p.m. That was the deadline. But the DOJ has missed that deadline. They're releasing documents in tranches, slowly, over time, in violation of what the law actually requires. And nobody is holding them accountable for that. This is how powerful institutions protect themselves and protect the powerful people they serve. They slow roll compliance with legal requirements. They release information in carefully managed ways that minimize impact. They make mistakes that expose victims while protecting the powerful. And they count on public attention moving on to other things before anyone can piece together the full picture of what the evidence actually shows. But survivors aren't going to let this go. They're demanding to see financial records. They want the full list of indictments from the original sweetheart deal that Epstein got. They want all the paperwork that proves the negligence and corruption that let Epstein continue abusing for years after his first arrest. They want accountability not just from Epstein, but from everyone who enabled him and everyone who protected the powerful men in his network. And we should all want that too, because what these document releases are showing us is that our system is broken at every level. Law enforcement that doesn't investigate powerful people, prosecutors who document evidence but don't act on it, Justice Department officials who protect presidents instead of pursuing justice, media that lets the story get buried under other news, and a public that's supposed to just accept that massive documented connections to a sex trafficker are no big deal as long as criminal charges haven't been filed. That's not acceptable. Trump traveled extensively on Epstein's plane during the years when Epstein's trafficking operation was active. He traveled with women who became witnesses in criminal proceedings. His property was used to recruit victims. Federal prosecutors found his connections significant enough to document and investigate. Epstein himself believed Trump shared his predatory interests. All of that is now documented fact from government records. And Trump's response is to complain that releasing this information ruins people's reputations, as if reputations built on lies and carefully hidden associations with predators deserve protection, as if transparency about powerful people's connections to sex trafficking operations is somehow unfair, as if we should all just accept his word that his relationship with Epstein was innocent despite mountains of evidence suggesting otherwise. No. We shouldn't accept that. We should demand full transparency. We should demand that every document gets released completely and immediately as the law requires. We should demand that prosecutors who documented troubling evidence years ago explain why they never acted on it. We should demand accountability from everyone who enabled Epstein and everyone who protected the powerful men he associated with, because anything less is a betrayal of justice and a betrayal of every victim who suffered at the hands of predators who believed their wealth and power made them untouchable. These documents prove they were right to believe that. The system did protect them. The system is still protecting them. And the only way that changes is if enough people refuse to let this story disappear into the next news cycle. So pay attention, share this information, demand answers, because this is what corruption looks like. And if we don't confront it, if we just accept institutions failing to do their jobs because the targets are too powerful, then we deserve the broken system we'll be left with.